Welcome back to the Bonsai Builders podcast. I'm your host, Addison Galambos. From the very first episode, the premise of this show has been a question. Can a dedicated hobbyist with enough passion and the right resources create top-level bonsai without uprooting their life for a traditional apprenticeship? Today, I'm sitting down with the person who is perhaps most qualified and maybe most skeptical to answer that question. He's one of the world's top bonsai artists, the founder of Bonsai Mirai, and someone who has consistently floored me with their depth of knowledge and passion for bonsai. That, of course, is Ryan Neal. Thanks for joining in today, Ryan.
That was very flattering, Addison. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think that, maybe something that gets lost in the airways. Everyone obviously knows you love bonsai, but having interacted with you in person in classes this year, it really comes across like the depth of passion and love you have for bonsai and the amount of thought and time that you put into everything that, like your obsession around bonsai, which is obviously for someone who is similarly obsessed, obviously very cool to see.
Yeah, I appreciate that. No, I mean, it's kind of hard to quantify, honestly, at this point in time, because it's become such like an embedded part of my life. There have been like times where throughout my life, people have challenged me with finding balance. Like this word balance keeps like being thrown at me, like something I need to be striving for, like a Zelda game or something. And I'm always kind of like, you don't really get to do great things in your chosen endeavor while also trying to find balance. I can appreciate that striking a balance with, your life and family and career and self-care and all that stuff, like really is something to shoot for a lot of people. But I think I didn't do this thinking that I was ever going to lead like a normal life. I wanted to see how far I could push myself and how far I could take this. So, when I look at it now, because I do have a normal life outside of bonsai, I have 4 boys and a wife and, like a whole life outside of this world that, when I started, I never thought I would have all of those things. Like that wasn't anticipated. It wasn't like even in my sort of line of sight for life. There's obviously the necessity to think about it, but more than like trying to dub down my passion for bonsai, I've sort of tried to find how I fit that normal life into this lifestyle that I lead, which is sort of a life dedicated, to trees.
So for you, the dedication to trees came first and then the normal life came second. So that was your journey, was one from complete dedication to complete dedication with sustainability or with other considerations also included.
Yeah. I mean, because I started this whole journey when I was 12. So I wasn't thinking about a family and kids when I was 12. I was just like so smitten with the art form when I found it and so voracious to know more about it. And then so driven to get to Japan to apprentice with Mr. Kimura, to collect great trees out of the wild growing up in Colorado. That was like how I started bonsai, was not necessarily starting with nursery stock or something like that. I mean, I almost immediately started collecting with my dad, and Harold Sasaki taught me how to do that well, or at least gave me, clues on how to do that well. And that's continued to kind of be a through line through college in California. I spent most of my weekends either going down to the Southern California bonsai community, the Bay Area bonsai community, or to the Sierra Nevadas trying to find tiny trees that I could, collect and turn into incredible bonsai. But the biggest problem with, my biggest problem was finding incredible trees, like from a very young age. I mean, I still have my first collected tree that I collected with my dad when I was 12. And I just had no clue how to handle this like rugged, incredible Yamadori that we were finding and is present in a lot of different environments. And the more that I get into it, the more I realize there's kind of Yamadori everywhere if you just sort of expand your perception of the different forms that these trees can take on to emulate nature in miniature, and the different species that maybe nobody's ever thought of turning into bonsai that are sitting out there with small little quirks and keys to tapping into their potential and being able to utilize them and derive the techniques that allow you to reduce their growth and create scalable proportional design. Yeah, having that exposure and not having the resources or the knowledge, utility knowledge, technique, artistry, design, like the construct of process, etc. I really had no choice but to go to Japan because I knew from like 12 years old what was possible. I saw this stuff and I saw that not really many people knew how to work with it. And obviously, like, the story is pretty widely distributed of me seeing Mr. Kimura's work in a bonsai today, where he took this, juniper shrub looking thing as they come out of the wild looking and turned it into this masterpiece. And I was just like, okay, well, I need to study with him because I want to learn how to do that, and the deeper dive is that I really felt like he gave it a human personality and like a soul and spirit. So there was like an anthropomorphizing of the tree into something I could relate to on an emotional level that I really wanted to learn from him specifically. But it was such a complex bag of techniques that he applied to that tree, and I didn't know how to do any of them. I didn't even know how to wire a tree when I went to Japan. I mean, I gave it my best guess, but like the process of wiring a tree was not something that somebody could explain to me. Like, how do you crack into this massive scope of work on any tree, let alone a big, impressive tree that has to have big moves and has to have real confidence expressed in the structural setting? And how do you move big things? How do you bend things? How do you do all of this stuff? I just like the list of questions was almost infinite. And I couldn't get those answered. So that's what I had to do. I didn't have a choice more than anything, and I don't think people really realize that. Like, I knew what the potential of American bonsai was before I ever went to Japan. And I knew that it was limited by our lack of knowledge of technique and structure, if you will, to the process of bonsai. Like nobody that I ever studied with had like a structure that they taught me to pursue design on a higher level, and the technique that is executed and when it's executed and how it's executed and all of the nuances of that execution that you've got to think about. So it's just, there was no other option. I didn't have another option. And in coming back, my goal has been to give people that option, to be able to learn those things, to teach them that structure, to teach them those techniques, because I always wanted to see what was possible when everybody had the same technique. There's like a little bit of a competitive notion in that for me. Like I loved sports, and I think the thing about sports that I really liked was the necessity to kind of dig deep, and you saw whose will and desire and time spent outside of that moment kind of express themselves in the endeavor of competition. And I'm not saying that like competition is what drives me in bonsai, but if you democratize the knowledge, there is a real open door to what can be created and what can other people's work can inspire me. Hopefully my work can inspire other people, but like what's the upper ceiling of our artistry in bonsai? And I still think we're trying to find that still. I think that's a almost infinite playground.
I have a few questions from that. That was very interesting. The first thing that I thought when you were talking about like, hey, I needed this knowledge. A lot of the stuff that you've built with Mirai Live and the content that you've built makes a lot of sense in the context of you're teaching what you would have wanted to know at that point, right? Like all that knowledge is exactly that. And like a high tide raises all ships, and that like if this knowledge is out there and, easily accessible to the extent it is with Mirai, it hopefully raises the quality of all bonsai in the US, right? With the democratization of that. So did you already know that you wanted to, something that you said that was interesting was like you really admired Kimura's ability to anthropomorphize the tree or like give it a spirit or soul. And to me, that speaks to like a unique organism, which is something that has always inspired me in bonsai. I don't always necessarily want to make a bonsai tree, but I want to make the best, I don't know what the right word for it is, but like the best version of that specific tree that I can, like take advantage of this natural thing that happened that is unique and 1 in a billion or whatever, right? This seed growing to be hundreds of years old and creating this piece of Yamadori. So I'm curious, like from your experience in Colorado and collecting trees in the mountains, did you already have that idea that like you wanted to make a bonsai tree out of it, or you wanted to make like a unique sculpture? Or I'm curious, like what was your idea going to Japan? Like what was your inspiration? And like, did you already have some of those thoughts about like bringing out the wild character of the tree?
Yeah. I mean, that's really, nobody's ever asked me that before. That's a really great question to ask. And I think, you don't know what you don't know until you know, And so like I went to Japan and I had been stockpiling my database. Like I really do think what you're capable of creating in any creative endeavor is built upon lived experience, capacity in terms of technique and knowledge, and then what your file system and your brain and imagination is filled with, And so like I had filled my brain bank with Japanese trees, a lot of California style, what I would consider to be early stage California style bonsai, whether it's, from the Naka school and his students and what was being done in Southern California, or whether it was Masi Mazumi's impact in the Bay Area, Johnny Uchida, Dennis Makashima. And when Boone really started blasting off in the Bay Area, seeing that jump in level, my head was being filled with that. Kathy Shaner, I had early exposure to her in like my first year of college teaching. She was teaching up at Eldorado Bonsai in Placerville. And I got to see her work a few big trees with students in a workshop up there where she was like doing big bends and major work, and seeing the outcome of that, and seeing Mitsuya come over and curate it was either 2001, 2002 GSBF convention in Sacramento. And I was just like, this was my data bank, And I'm like, oh, okay, so this is what bonsai is supposed to look like. And I knew what Yamadori looked like because I'd been collecting it since I was 12. I just didn't know how to get that Yamadori to look like these images of bonsai. But then, I go to Japan and all of a sudden I'm inundated with Mr. Kimura's work, which to me is the highest level of bonsai that's ever been achieved on planet Earth with the art form of bonsai. Like, I think he just was so innovative. His engineering and creativity and the application of techniques, what a lot of people don't give him enough credit for is his mastery of horticulture was insane. Like, that was maybe his biggest technique, is he could do these crazy things and nobody else would be able to keep them alive but him. He was incredibly intuitive and just like so astute and skilled in the horticultural realm. But then he also had, beyond like the technique to do it and the horticulture to do it, he had the same creative genius in his artistry. So I was just getting this like triad of information that was creating different angles that I could approach design from the horticultural approach to the technical approach to the artistic approach, and seeing those three things dovetail, seeing one dominate the other two in terms of being the source of the inspiration or the outcome of the work. And all of a sudden, Mr. Kimura really insisted that we study his style. So like we weren't allowed to go to other gardens and look around unless he took us, which is different than a lot of masters. So I was very much inside of the walls of Mr. Kimura's tutelage, taking in a lot of trees coming in from other gardens that we were doing the work on, specifically for the Kokufu or for clients throughout the different regions of Japan, where a broker would represent a lot of clients and bring several different client trees in, and seeing historical trees come in, Kicho bonsai to be redesigned, a lot of Kimbone photo shoots, and seeing historical trees handled in different ways, and the sort of historical component being factored in, but also working with this tremendous once in several generation artist who kind of had carte blanche on a lot of these pieces to make decisions of how they were going to evolve and improve. And so the same pressure applied to Mr. Kimura in these historical redesigns, but he just handled it so confidently because of his acumen in all of these fields that impacted design. And all of a sudden I was like, oh my gosh, okay, the world of creativity is kind of my oyster. And I knew that there were things in North America that I really didn't know exist. I knew they existed, but I didn't know how they would impact my work. And so through like the 6 years of my apprenticeship, I had this little notebook that I would just make these notes of like things I wanted to do, things I wanted to try, things I wanted to see, ideas that I would have. I would write them on little note cards. I used to eat a lot of Yoplait yogurt as an apprentice, and like I have all these Japanese Yoplait yogurt like cardboard packages that held the little plastic canisters of Yoplait that are covered in like drawings and notes that I still have and still reference from time to time. Cause like, just like Bonsai Techniques 1 and 2 with John Naka, there's a lot of techniques in there that people have forgotten or were way ahead of their time. And you go back and you look at it and you're like, wow, this is powerful stuff. And I've never seen anybody actually apply this. And there's a lot of gold in those books of John's ideas and sketches and concepts that have never really been put into action. And I've got this notebook of ideas that, you know, everybody has ideas, has a lot of ideas, but capturing those ideas when you have them is a discipline, because it goes away and you don't get it back. Like that's just a ephemeral moment where you tap into some creative vein and, you know, floating in the air or the universe or the energy or experience, or, you know, that moment in your brain where all the chemistry comes together to give you that creative thought. And it's like, if you don't grab it, it's like a cloud. It just kind of dissipates. And so I didn't know that I was going to find so much inspiration from the natural environment as a literal translation. But when I became disconnected from my apprenticeship, post-apprenticeship, and recognizing, you know, as hard as I had tried to integrate into Mr. Kimura's system and not be a weak link as a foreigner and, you know, not let the quality of Mr. Kimura's facility decline in any way under sort of me being the head apprentice for a number of years. And then I recognized that like that, not a foothold, but that position was not secure because I was a foreigner and I was practicing bonsai out of country, and I was now experiencing different pressures and inspirations that were impacting my design. That was like the best thing that could have happened. It was hurtful, and I've talked about that, but it was the best thing that could have happened because I came back and almost immediately, within days of getting back from that experience, I drove down and saw the bristlecones and the sequoias and the redwoods and just took off in a completely different direction. And still, you know, one thing I've tried to like really, as I've processed through like maturing and having gone through 15 years of being a bonsai professional independent of my apprenticeship and really finding my own way, creating my own garden that is entirely different than what you would see in Japan, and creating a lot of trees that are, I think, really tapping into the vein of natural representation more than cultural representation. I still very much apply the consistent model of traditional design to a lot of the trees at Mirai, but I want to be able to do it all. I really do have a value system around what it means to be a bonsai professional and what it means to be a proficient artist. And I feel like you should be able to tap into any expression and to do it at the highest level. If you're true, you know, professional is an insufficient term. If you're, the Japanese would say a shokunin, and our translation of that would be a master. If you're a master of a medium, then you should be able to manipulate that medium freely.
So, okay, a few things I wanted to tap into there. One was, you talked about these three elements of bonsai, right? Like horticulture, technique, aesthetic, which I think is a really accurate model. I would almost say that there's like a fourth aspect too that I've been kind of noodling around that I find very interesting, which is like the time and development of self aspect of bonsai, because I think like your trees are a representation of you in some way, shape, or form, right? Like your tendencies and your discipline is going to result in the product that you create, right? As well as your aesthetic choices and what's influenced you, right? In the kind of art that you create. So, and the other thing is like bonsai happens over a very long time period, right? It's not, you know, something that, so like if you're pursuing bonsai, you're making specific decisions in your life in order to set yourself up for this pursuit that happens over a long time period, right? And so this is a little bit more of like a existential pillar to bonsai, I'd say, but I'm always very fascinating in hearing people's like their personal journeys as they go through bonsai and how they use bonsai as like a fulcrum for making changes in themselves in service of creating this really interesting and like time intensive product. Like you said before about people don't like being passionate and going all in on something, like you can do things that like, that's how interesting things happen, right? I've always struggled with kind of the opposite challenge that you have of like wanting to be open to everything and like extremely flexible in my life and thus like never cutting off opportunities. But if you don't make really strong decisions, sometimes you just aren't going to get to the same distance as someone else who does, right? And so it's interesting to hear your journey of making that really strong decision, like doing something so, off the beaten path as going to Japan for 6 years at such a young age, like having the mindset and the ability to go do that. And then I have almost the opposite challenge where I'm like, oh, like I want to be open to, anything. And then I cut myself off from accomplishing certain things just because I don't make that choice to go all in sometimes. Right. And so it's cool to hear about how people's own personal journeys interact with their bonsai, because really, if you're doing bonsai and you want to do it at a high level, there are sacrifices you have to make. I mean, it may or may not be a sacrifice for you depending on the lifestyle you want to live, right? And then you also have to be really intentional, because amazing bonsai trees don't happen just from nothing. They don't happen from lack of effort.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think when you start to talk about tapping into like the highest level, no matter if that's the lifestyle you want to lead or not, it demands a tremendous amount of sacrifice, because there's so many things we can be doing in the mobile world right now and the rapid exchange of information that you have to decide that this is what you're going to do. And I think a lot of people that don't pursue bonsai professionally feel like, oh, I would love to do that. That would be fantastic. I would do bonsai all day long. And it's like, oh, you think you would do bonsai all day long, but that's not what it looks like to be a bonsai professional. There's a lot of legwork and tough stuff that you have to do to be a bonsai professional, make a living at bonsai. And even inside of, let's just say, in a utopic world, you made bonsai all day long and somehow figured out how that earned you a living. Even inside of that, there's a lot of stuff that's not that fun. It's not like executing these awesome ideas and these radical techniques and sitting in this romantic notion of whether you think it's meditative or creative gluttony or, self-actualization or dream aspiration and, like design build to the final ground up, etc. Like all of the different beautiful things that you would think bonsai would be like. It's none of those. That's my experience anyways, but like living the lifestyle of bonsai is accepting that the hard work, which I would say the unenjoyable work, and I can always say like I love it all, so like that's why I continue to do it. But if I'm just being really honest with you, I don't love it all. I love it all inside of the notion that it allows me to do this thing that is an expression, and that expression and getting that out of myself allows me to know more about myself, which is, to your point, bonsai is this major growth metaphor and mechanism for us to see ourselves in a way that maybe only having like a best friend that's truly honest with you could help you see yourself. But the tree's far like softer about that, because it doesn't actually tell you that. You just look at it and you get these like gut instincts deep inside yourself that tell you like, I missed that. I didn't do that right. Shoot, I wasn't patient enough. Gosh, I haven't been, watering correct. Like all of the things. And then you say like, I haven't been watering correctly. What does that mean? It's like, I'm not really taking the intentional time I need to focus on the things that I value and love. I need to make some changes to be able to watering this correctly as a metaphor for like, I need to do something to get where I want to go and do it in the way that I want to do it, which is like, that's really kind of the rubric in the Monopoly game of life, is like trying to live this life in a way that when you're, and this is my assumption, obviously, but live this life in a way that looking back, when you're sort of conceiving everything that you've accomplished in this one chance that we know for sure we have, we try to feel good about it and hopefully to not regret a lot of what we've done, or a majority of what we've done, or feel like we did it to the best of our capacity. At least that's how it makes sense to me. And so like that watering decision is this tiny little reminder inside of the bonsai practice about such a greater life perspective and value system on life. I guess for me anyways, that's how bonsai resonates for me. I do feel like my perspective telescopes in and out constantly from like, this is a little branch that I'm wiring. The intention that I bring to that branch, the style that I give that branch, the experience of wiring that branch with everything else that's happening around me can be extrapolated all the way to like where am I at in life right now as a person, and am I happy about where I'm at and how I am in this space and in this moment in time? How am I as a father? How am I as a husband? Am I as a professional? How am I as a friend? And like all of that just came from like wiring a few little branches on a juniper and being like, I need to make some changes. So like that kind of psychs me out quite a bit. I get pretty woo-woo about bonsai because from 12, it was my way of understanding myself as I relate to the world. But then going back to like the whole stylistic thing and like building the database and stuff, I really think that people do not put enough weight or even really consider, how does the environment that I exist in impact me as an individual? And that was really why I started taking bonsai into the wild. Now, I didn't know that's what I was looking for. I just knew I was looking for something different and wondering what would happen if I changed the context. Because I certainly had the experience of making bonsai in Japan. And I certainly came back to the United States and recognized making bonsai in the United States was different, and making bonsai at Mirai was different, and making bonsai when I went to Europe was different. And it was actually on stage at the Nolanders Trophy the very first time I demonstrated that I was like, ooh, I made something different here. I'm in Europe. I'm under different context and impression, different cultural aspects, different languages, different vibes and energy in terms of the people I'm interacting with. And something different came from that. And that was like the first planted seed for me of like, what happens under all of these different contexts when I change my environment. And it really started to teach me that we are ultimately kind of like a passive filtration system for all of the stimuli that we take in, like our brain, our sensory organs, and how all of that moves through our psychology and manifests in something that we express through our, tangible creation with our hands, especially in bonsai. And it's like, I'm interpreting this tree, but if I'm interpreting this tree inside of a geometric box in a temperate rainforest, or a geometric box in a Mediterranean region, or I'm interpreting this inside of a completely organic environment where I'm looking at a literal translation of a certain age of a tree species in context under environmental influences, what comes out of my hands is different. And I don't have to try. And then I started thinking like, wow, that is crazy, because the organization that we give bonsai in the built environment does not fit in the natural environment. And the lack of organization that made that tree feel authentic to that natural environment when brought to the built environment feels disorganized. And I started looking at that as like, which environment do I feel better in? And I am an individual who feels better in the wild environment. Like that is where I feel like I'm my best self. I don't have the same hangups. I don't have the same reactivity. I don't have the same sort of, up-down cycle of mood or pressures, or a lot of the things that impact us, whether it's monetary or interpersonal or, political, whatever the things that impact us and cause us stress in the built environment. When you're in the natural environment, that stuff goes away. It's so insignificant to like, I need to find water because I need to survive. I need to have some food. I need to not fall off this cliff. And like all of that other stuff kind of dwindles away.
Yeah, just a whole different hierarchy of things that are on top of your mind, right?
Yeah. And so then I started like recognizing that is where it's where as an organism we came from. And I do think it's where as an organism we still need to be rooted in to be our best selves. And that disconnection, I think, is seen in the heavily conflicted world that we're living in on a global level right now, for sure, where the natural environment is a sacrificial lamb to the immediate sort of resource exploitation, et cetera, et cetera. But I think beyond that, I started recognizing that a bonsai tree, when you look at it, when somebody's intentionally created it, tells you everything about them. And that's become super fascinating, because you don't need to talk to somebody to look at their tree and know a lot about them. And so, like for me, even bonsai is an interpersonal expression that allows me to have a background, or at least an awareness, not a detailed list or knowledge of somebody, but an awareness of somebody. And I really like that, because now the form of the tree and the expression of what's created is adding to the conversation that hasn't even yet taken place with somebody that I've never met before.
Yeah, I definitely, I'm early on that journey of like being able to tell things about people from their trees, but from the people that I work with closely, like, or my own work or Sam's work, like I can see like, oh, okay, like Because of this tendency I have, my tree, when I completed it, ended up looking like this. And thus I need to change something about myself if I want to get a different product, right? Or it's just interesting to see what people are trying to say with their trees and whether they want to say something explicitly or not. I think it comes out what they're trying to say or what stuff about them in their trees, which I think is a very interesting dynamic. And I wonder how much of that is like because it's a living thing versus like, is that unique to bonsai versus any other artistic expression? Maybe not. Probably in people's paintings or different things like that, you can also get some of that, but I'm not as familiar with those other mediums, so maybe that's why.
I think that's the purpose of art, ultimately is to express yourself. I think that's when somebody's trying to recreate something that's been created, that is, in my mind, that's a craft, because you're executing the technique and you're mimicking a style and you're trying to emulate that. And then that's a craft because you're not expressing yourself through that. Even if you're like, well, I'm expressing myself by saying that I like this or that I'm inspired by this, and so I'm trying to create it. It's like, no, that's not a powerful context to be conveying to somebody that you like something. It's like when you see somebody experiencing confusion or pain or inspiration or excitement or passion, and you see the work that they create, that is the work, I think, that really grabs people and creates great art and creates timeless art. And I think that frankly, I think that people saw that in Mr. Kimura's work. And I think it was before there was a vernacular or a perception or conceptualization of bonsai having that kind of power, because it had been such a cultural representation for so long. And he kind of flipped it upside down, literally and figuratively, but he took it as far as, and continues to take it far, but took it as far, I think, in like the prime of his career as he had the capacity to express, with the tools that he had. And now we have more tools, not necessarily more techniques. And I'm not saying anybody's ever going to usurp Mr. Kimura, but there's so much more information being taken in on a continual basis living in the modern era right now with technology and, now AI and globalization and population density and more built environment, less and less natural environment and stuff. So it's really shifting the ability to take this art form as far as we've ever perceived it to go or beyond.
Yeah, definitely on the upswing in terms of, at least globally. And hopefully that sees more people doing it and more geniuses like Mr. Kimura arising from that, fact that there's more people doing it, and hopefully just continues to refine the pursuit, right?
Yeah, but I want to go back to something that you said too, where you said, I style a tree a certain way and I recognize there's something about myself I need to change. That could be a perception that you take from seeing your work and like really kind of digging deep and like, why did I do that? Why do I do this? Why do I gravitate towards that? Why is that my preference? And like trying to dissect that and really put it under a microscope. What I want to continue to challenge people to do is to change the context in which they create. Addison, what happens when you make a tree at Mirai? What happens when you make a tree at Sam's? What happens when you make a tree in your own home? And then what happens when you make a tree out in the wild environment? Like I took Todd out on a Mirai in the wild, and I saw Todd do something that I've never seen him do before out there. And I saw how that illuminated Todd. Now, whether he's done it again since or not, I don't know. He and I haven't really talked about that since we did that project in the Rockies. But I know that he was inspired to do it again. The problem is it's a pain in the ass, right? It's like, it takes a lot of freaking doing to get out there, get a tree out there, get to that spot, walk out to that spot, sit your ass down, find a compatible tree, gather the inspiration. It's not comfortable. A lot of times it's painful. A lot of times the elements aren't favorable. But like, if you want to know more about yourself, taking yourself out of the comfort of the environment and putting yourself into discomfort and seeing what you create is how I've learned more about myself than any other application of bonsai to date. So I do really want to encourage people that are super invested in bonsai to challenge themselves with that. That's not like a proprietary activity that I took on. I really think it came full circle to the root origin of how penjing started in China. I don't know that they were creating penjing out in these places, but they were certainly coming back and trying to capture the essence of what they experienced with the original model of the miniaturized tree reflecting these harsh environments. And so, then taking that one step farther and going out to that space, especially with the inundation of built, organized environment and society that we have around us, it's a properly powerful, potentially for some people that are invested in spirituality, very spiritual thing. In fact, I really came to the conclusion in the projects that I've done and continue to seek to do that ultimately those places are probably the birth of religion in a lot of ways, finding that sense of place in such a infinite galactic space, ultimately, right? Like, oh, wow, I'm here now, and I don't have long to be here in the relative time frame of the universe, but like, this is special, and I'm in it, and I'm present, and I'm going to take this and I'm going to translate it to the best of my ability into the thing that I brought to hold that moment as a time capsule of this experience.
Yeah, that inspiration. I love that the idea of like even the environment that you're in is a variable in the product that you output, right? And like that impacts this like simulation of like where the tree ends up being, right? Almost as if your capabilities are like a static part of the creation process, and then adding these different variables creates a different end product, even with your same technical abilities or other past experiences. So I think this brings me to a question that I have been wondering a lot about, which is, and I think you're uniquely placed to answer, is, you've studied in Japan and you know the meta for like what a bonsai tree should look like. How do you think that, like coming back to the United States, how do you think, should we be trying to make every tree in the United States into exactly what the idea of bonsai is in Japan? Or are there like cultural, contextual, like the type of material that we have access to? Are these variables that you think should influence like the actual goal of like what a bonsai tree is in the context of North America? Like how should design be different because we're in the US and we have all these different things than it is in Japan, if we want to someday surpass it instead of just mimicking it, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think for me, the way that this makes sense is, and this is what I've really become sort of like a outspoken proponent of the tree leading the dance, because let's be really clear, like some material is destined for the patternized application of the traditional model. Like it just is. Like that's going to be its best version of itself. On the recent Behind the Branch stream that we did on Mirai Live, like I broke down the traditional model of bonsai design, like through and through thoroughly. I brought out some archive videos from my time in Japan, some trees that I originally created at Mirai, and the tree that I worked on, a gigantic ponderosa pine, absolutely was handled in a traditional manner. And it was the best version of that tree. There was not going to be a rock outcropping, wind-informed or snow-informed version of that ponderosa pine that was going to take the aesthetic and quality of that tree beyond the traditional expression that I created. And I firmly believe that. The tree had all the elements to execute traditional design, and that was how that tree was going to be the best expression of what that material had to offer. And I do think our motivation needs to be maximizing the potential of the material, which means you've got to have the data bank of images and the understanding of the ecology to break down natural design and decide if that's something that's going to take advantage of that tree's characteristics and maximize its design. And obviously that's subjective to a degree, but I don't really know that I believe it is subjective if you're putting the weight on the tree and you're not married or attached to one approach over another, which I think is really when you do give the tree its greatest voice and ability to inform the design process as it's going to be expressed in this art form. Some trees have the characteristics to be natural representations, and some trees have the characteristics to be more of a traditional modeled design, which is honestly a very long-standing design process that we have to recognize has been worked through and massaged and marinated in Japan for hundreds of years under the hands of people that are super disciplined and dedicated to the highest level of achieving perfection in their craft and art. And so there's merit in that. It's not a derogatory thing to say this is a traditional tree. It's not a derogatory thing to say this is a natural representation of a tree. It's just, what does the material have to offer? And do you have the breadth and your abilities and your perspective to be able to see that and manifest the greatest representation of that piece of material at that time? And here's the other thing about that can shift. Because when you give your input to a tree, the beautiful thing about this medium is that the tree is going to respond, and that response can conjure a different image or a different understanding. And as you said earlier, right, bonsai is kind of this timeline of your journey as an individual, because as you change, your perception of the trees is going to change, and the trees are changing, and their perception of you and that relationship that you form tree to tree is going to shift. And there are a lot of trees at Mirai that have moved from traditional bonsai to natural forms, and natural forms back to traditional forms. And there are historical stylings across Japan of famous trees from the era of, the Tokugawa family all the way through World War II and beyond, where they've changed fronts, they've changed angles, they've changed design. I wouldn't say hundreds of times, but dozens of times, over the course of time. And that just adds to the richness and history and the time capsule nature of bonsai as this living art that continues to evolve. And like all of that, there's no one way, there's no two-dimensional model, there's no singular timeline to look at bonsai on as an art form, because it's got too much depth. It's got too much depth with the tree and its physiology and behavior and response, and the individuals handling it and the environment in which it's cultivated and the period of time over which it manifests all of these conceptualized ideas and applications. It's an infinite opportunity pursuit, because everything is always going to be possible if given enough time and the correct care. And so all of a sudden, it's like this becomes more a conversation of each time we handle a tree, that's where we were at and that's where it was at. And that's what it became, and then that's going to change, for intentional, for the better, for the worse, intentionally, unintentionally, and those things are all tracked in the form of that tree as it continues to evolve.
Yeah, the thing that is a little tough, I think, or that I struggle with is like, it's hard to, like, it's very well defined what is like a quality tree within the context of the traditional model, right? Like you can go like, oh, like it has this taper and the branch comes out on the left and then the right and then the top, right? Or whatever. And there's these rules, right? And it's harder, I think, to like quantify quality whenever you break from that model, right? And so are we, if we make these non-traditional trees, are they like in exhibition or in the public forum, like are they seen as lower quality or lower value because of they don't fit the traditional model? Like I'm curious about your thoughts on like that concept and whether or not that should even dictate whether you style a tree in a certain way or not. But I'm curious on your thoughts on that.
I think there's a prejudice and there's a perception of them being, what could I say? A waste of a piece of material that could have made a great traditional design. I think there's still that perception, like we could have generated this known quantity and this known entity, and instead we did this thing that's something different. And I think people, if you haven't exercised the muscle of designing hundreds, if not thousands, of traditional trees, to get to a point where you're like, wow, this is kind of the same thing in just a little bit of a different manifestation over and over and over again. What else is possible? Which, anybody, if you do it enough, is going to get to a point where you're going to say, what else is possible? But if you haven't exercised that muscle to that point, then there is a desire to keep trying. Like our brain is designed to try and develop mastery or proficiency to the point that it becomes efficient. Right? So that our brain can focus energy on things that we're not efficient at or proficient at, and to learn how to become proficient at that thing. I think there's literally a psychological component to this where if you haven't gained proficiency in the traditional model or haven't exercised that until there's a fluency there, then it does, the urge to create that and continue working at that is like your brain literally trying to master that form and shape, which ties into brain physiology in general because of the scale and proportion of the traditional model and the notion of the golden rule. Like all of that stuff, I don't think we think about how that impacts our decisions and our sensations and feelings and emotions about certain things. But I think there's another thing that works against the natural style of trees, and that is in the natural form of trees, what you said about, okay, the taper and the tip and the ramification and stuff like that. I think what we have seen of natural renditions or natural interpretations in the bonsai form have sort of used this notion of this is natural as a way to skirt the high level of technique and the high level of execution and the high level of refinement and the high level of the craft to get to the point where that's recognized on an equal footing as the most highly executed traditional form. And I would tell you, Addison, that I don't see why and I think having seen that is lacking, because you're talking about pioneers like Walter Paul and Dan Robinson and Nick Lenz, and I'm trying to think of, there's a few other Von Banting, right? And some of these guys Katsumi Kinoshita, some of these guys that have created some of the most powerful natural representations in miniature. But those are pioneers from several generations ago where they didn't have access to the highest level of technique, where they weren't taught the structure of wiring. And so there's the craft component and the technical component of bonsai might not have been as strong in their work, but their inspiration and interpretation is incredible. And I always thought, man, if you could take that highest level of craft and technique from the traditional model that's been massaged and marinated into a fluency in Japan and taught to now a lot of foreign apprentices that are taking that on a global scale, and you apply that to the natural form so that it can't be discounted because the transition of taper is there, the scarlessness is there, or the ramification is there, and the refinement is there, and the maturity is there, and the mochikomi is there, and all of a sudden, all of the things that you say, well, that's what makes the traditional model so good, and you say, yes, but here is a natural aesthetic that has all of that merit. It feels like that's the beginning of being able to say, how can you not validate that as having these same elements and accepting that form is different? And I still think you're going to meet the resistance of a majority of the people looking at bonsai, practicing bonsai, and judging bonsai are probably never going to create enough of that pattern to fully master it and have fluency, and that will still physiologically inside of your brain's chemistry not allow you to see a form outside of that as equal. And I don't think it's even conscious.
Well, I have some thoughts on this maybe for a little bit later. The thing I wanted to point out though was I would say before coming to Mirai, even though I've kind of been in the Mirai ecosystem with learning from Todd and Sam, I had some skepticism of these wind influenced designs. I'll admit that. And when I came out to class this last session, you gave me this limber pine to work on, right? And I had only seen these wind influenced designs in kind of the first styling, right? And in my head, I thought, okay, this is really cool, but how does this become a refined bonsai? Does it showcase those elements of tertiary refinement and, age as a bonsai? How does this evolve, right? And when you gave me that tree, you saw what I did. I clearly didn't understand how it evolved. But after you came through the tree and showed hey, yes, we have this drop branch that's snow influenced and we have these upper branches that are wind influenced, but this tree still refines and gains technical merit as it ages, just like any other bonsai tree. That was really powerful lesson for me. And I think probably my takeaway from that is probably other folks, how many students do you have that get that same experience, right? It's a limited portion of the bonsai population. And so it's probably difficult for people to have that same realization without, being there and seeing you do that, right? So
yeah.
And I don't know if I fully agree with your people will I think if somebody saw that tree without my once the structural wire comes off, they would be wowed and they would see okay, this is a refined bonsai in this style. And I think it would be impressive within the exhibition context. I think that you may need to control the judging in such a way that people understand that, just like you said in the Artisan's Cup descriptions where you said like a natural bonsai and a traditional bonsai aren't necessarily, like, you might have to control for that in the rubric or like in the way that you train your judges to judge the exhibition. But I think it definitely could be treated fairly if that's taken into account within the judging framework.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope so. I mean, obviously Jonas and I, went back and forth on that in the podcast that we did about judging recently, and who am I to say? I mean, when I'm speaking on my own podcast, I'm happy to speak freely, as sharing my thoughts. I mean, people are tuning into the podcast to listen at least to some degree about what I have to say, or what the other person has to say in terms of that conversation. But who am I to say that's like the correct way to go about it? I think when I hear people say they want the greatest diversity, they want the highest quality trees, they want to represent all forms of bonsai and the creative capacity, they're when you're exhibiting and that's what you're asking for, or that's what you're stating your desire is, then those things all have to be considered equally inside of that space. And I think it's hard for that to happen right now. And I don't honestly know how you get like a greater community at large to that level unless you just put a lot of those trees in people's faces that are undeniably of a high quality. I mean, I think much to your point about the wind-informed limber that you wired, it's taken me 10 years of like massaging that design style. Nobody taught me how to create wind-informed like that. Like on the traditional design stream I just did, I showed, a quote unquote Fuki Nagashi or wind-informed tree at Mr. Kimura's, and it basically just looked like a pine tree that had a lot longer branches. Still had Kaishieta and counter branching and all of the stuff handled in a traditional pad formation and whatnot, but it's called Fuki Nagashi because it's like leaning way out to one side. And it's like, okay, that's not actually how wind impacts a tree, So it's taken like 10 years for that, or like the reiterative form in the redwood. That's taken me, almost 12 years to get to a point where I feel like I'm actually starting to hit a miniaturized reflection of what actually happens. And I've actually physically climbed into old growth redwood and climbed on reiterations and seen what they look like in the canopies of those trees to understand that better. So it's going to take time, and I can totally accept that it's going to take time. And I think it's going to take a lot of critical conversations like we're having now to start to introduce people to the idea, allow people to have their natural sort of reactivity to that, of like rejecting what's outside of their comfort zone or what they feel is right or what they feel is good, or their camp, their religion, their association in the bonsai realm, if you will, of their preferred aesthetic. And I think like the greatest gift that you can take on in bonsai is dropping all of those preconceived whatever value systems, because then you open yourself up to being able to appreciate more. And the reason that I think I can like work with it and deal with it is because I've gone through the same cycle. Like there were not deciduous trees at Mirai a decade ago. And now the deciduous garden is probably the portion of the garden that's growing in quality and artistry and execution at a higher level than any other portion of the garden. I mean, I'm like dramatically falling in love with broadleaf trees on a level that I never could have perceived. And 10 years ago, I didn't want a single one, couldn't care less, And there was a point in bonsai history in the United States, I mean, early 2000s, how many people really gave a significant amount of value to a pot? And it's like from the pot to the stand, from the stand to the accent. Look at the love that Kusamono's getting now, and the focus on the display, and how much Austin Heitzman and David Niddle and some of these stand makers have impacted bonsai in North America, and you're seeing it in Europe as well. And it's like, this is all part of the narrative arc and maturation of an art form. And so judging now is being called to task as we evolve in our appreciation and understanding of all of these different elements and accoutrements to the presentation of these trees that we've so painstakingly cultivated. And I think that it's appropriate to say, hey, let's raise the level of judging. And I love the fact that Jonas and Eric are putting a tremendous amount of time and attention into it. Whether I totally agree or not does not matter. It's their show. I can decide if I want to interact with it or not, but I still don't totally agree with the fact that there's subjectivity in judging. I don't think there should be subjectivity in judging. And people would say, well, there's no way you, Ryan Neal, can remove all of your bias. And I think that that's probably like relatively true, but I still don't totally agree with that either, because I think that you can. And I think that you can verify that you've done that if you pick a tree that you absolutely hate to win a show, because it is the best tree. And that has been an experience that I've had not once, but I've had, a dozen times where trees did not appeal to me in any way, aesthetically, material wise, tree container combo, but the quality of what was done and the execution and the technique and the knowledge of what it took to get that species to that level of refinement with that aesthetic and that container on that stand and that accent was undeniable, and that's like, okay, I think that you can actually. And I think that to raise the level of judging needs to be taught and instructed. I think people need to be informed. I think they need to be challenged. I used to set up mock exhibitions for my students at Mirai in the studio. And we would go through the judging rubric and we would judge them, and then talk about their merits as a group. And it's not something that I do any longer, because if I were going to teach judging, I would want to teach judging on a far more expansive scale, at exhibitions, teaching a judging course with people that really wanted to become judges and were seeking some sort of accreditation where they've had time and criticism of their scores. And people will continue to push back and say, but that's subjective. That's subjective. And I just don't agree with that. I simply don't. Not judging at the highest level, I don't agree with it. Until there becomes a monetary component that is so powerful, like being a Kokufu judge, where there is some potential backdoor financial exchanges to get a treat. Yeah. Or the Westminster Dog Show. I'm sure there's got to be political influence and monetary influence, or I would think anyways, because it's so large scale economic in its implications, right? Like, we don't have that in North America. And when you lack that, you can seize that innocence and accomplish a tremendous amount of goodwill in the expansion of the art form. But it will creep in someday. And all the more reason to have advanced the level before that creeps in and becomes a part of things.